The far-right extremist group, the Proud Boys, who played a key role in the January 6th insurrection, have been regrouping ahead of tomorrow's election and, among other things, have begun amplifying conspiracy theories on platforms like Telegram and Truth Social that a Trump loss could only be due to ballot fraud. They are just one of a number of groups already spreading disinformation on more right-wing fringe platforms. But the same disinformation is also showing up on the X site formerly known as Twitter, which is, of course, under the control of South African former undocumented immigrant turned immigrant hater Elon Musk, one of the biggest pushers of disinformation on the planet, and someone who reportedly speaks regularly with Vladimir Putin. Musk is, of course, helping to bankroll Trump's campaign and running part of the ground operation, one might say, into the ground. A group of mostly black canvassers who were tricked into canvassing in Michigan, seatbelt free in the back of a cargo van, were fired after speaking out to a Wired reporter. Seems you can take the boy out of apartheid, but not the apartheid out of the boy. Elon Musk has a huge financial stake in the outcome of this election. He has billions of dollars in current defense contracts and would love to control a president who could cut his taxes and deregulate his businesses while putting him in charge of government functions, all while he remains the owner of one of the biggest social media platforms, where he can allow right-wing disinformation to run rampant to try to help his candidate win. Joining me now is MSNBC political analyst David Jolly, who served in Congress as a Republican but is no longer affiliated with the party. I think the biggest question that I have when I look at Elon Musk and the various ways he's involved in the campaign is, how is it legal? You were in Congress. How is it legal?
Yeah, well, you saw some of it play out in court today.
In Philly, yeah.
Of his $1 million gifts. And honestly, it was a fairly strategic argument they made that actually this isn't a lottery. We pre-selected brand ambassadors and therefore gave them $1 million. And I think that's part of what's unsettling about Elon Musk's involvement is he is more sophisticated and sober and thoughtful, I know that sounds crazy, than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is pure chaos.
I mean, isn't everyone?
I know. But in terms of election meddling, disinformation, and so forth, you have an actor in Elon Musk who actually lawyers up with real lawyers for achieving the end means, or the end that he wants to achieve. And then you bring in the fact that as you mentioned, the Wall Street Journal has reported his frequent conversations with Vladimir Putin. His own social media following is at 200 million people that he can reach with disinformation. And we know where his treasure is, so is his heart. He wants Donald Trump to win this race, and he's going to influence it by any means necessary, legal or otherwise.
And, I mean, I have a headline here from NBC. Elon Musk's misleading election claims this year have reached 1.2 billion with a B people on X Twitter because he controls the algorithm. And so we've never had a situation where you have somebody controlling the algorithm of what everyone is taking in. He can suppress Democratic posts and suppress Democratic content, boost Trump content, and he's essentially sort of mind melding with billions of people to try to get Trump elected for his own enrichment.
That's right.
And so at some point, doesn't Congress need to think about some sort of regulation to not allow somebody like that to play on both sides of a political election?
Yeah, a big question about the regulation of social media platforms. Is it a provider for free speech communities, or is it a producer of content? And Elon Musk raises the interesting question because he controls it and he's producing the disinformation. And so you have 500 million users roughly of X, or formerly Twitter. You have 200 million daily users. Here's the most worrisome part for me, Joy, is this. We know the influence disinformation can have on the election itself.
Right.
We know Russia, China, Iran, all the foreign actors want to cause chaos and disinformation. It's verifiable that Elon Musk is amplifying that disinformation going into tomorrow night. The most worrisome part is the day after the election. Or tomorrow night when Donald Trump declares victory.
Which
falsely.
he will.
And now to have an ally with Elon Musk who amplifies the false conspiracies of a Donald Trump victory, or helps Donald Trump contest this in states. We're repeating 4 years ago what led to January 6th, fueled by disinformation and lies. And we expect it from Donald Trump, but I think we're late to the game to realize Elon Musk might be an even greater purveyor going into this January 6th than Donald Trump.
And we can't count on the Republican Party writ large to say anything about it, right? So if he comes out and says he won, Marco Rubio will say he won, and Tim Scott will say he won. They're all going to repeat it. And then where are we as a country heading into another January 6th? Thank goodness it's Joe Biden in charge of the National Guard, and he will protect the Capitol. But where do we stand if the Republican Party, even if Trump loses definitively, still doesn't have the guts. And corporate America, we're now hearing, will not come forward and try to say this is unacceptable.
That morning after scenario, again, not to be a Debbie Downer, we're like 48 hours from this.
Yeah.
And one of the first ways Donald Trump will try to say the election was stolen is there will very likely be an undervote in most states between the number of people who vote for Donald Trump and the next down ballot statewide Republican.
Right.
And that's how Republicans say, oh, votes are stolen from Trump. They don't realize people just don't like Donald Trump.
They don't like him.
That's why they're doing it. And so it leads us to a place where the certification of the election once again is in question. And I think what Donald Trump is ultimately playing to is that he doesn't care who declares the election this cycle. He doesn't care if MSNBC or AP or
doesn't matter.
Anybody else declares it. This is a race all the way to January.
That's right.
For Donald Trump. And a lot of people, even Republicans, even MAGA Republicans might say Donald Trump loses and he goes away. He doesn't go away. He might go to prison, but I promise you, he will consider running in 2028.
Yeah.
And if he is not the king in 28, he'll be the kingmaker. Yeah. He will have an apprentice Republican primary down at Mar-a-Lago to control the 28 process. He's not going anywhere.
He doesn't want to go anywhere. Last question. Could you ever imagine that a presidential candidate would do what he did with that microphone in front of children, in front of families with kids?
There is a deep cultural rot in the country, and it's reflected in our politics. And I credit Stuart Stevens many years ago when he said, Donald Trump didn't change us, he revealed us. Yeah. Donald Trump has revealed who we are in this country. Yeah. It reflects a deep culture.
Between that and the people laughing when he talked about shooting the press, the people behind him laughing, it's pretty disgusting and vulgar. We need to do better as a country. David Jolly, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Thank you very much, my friend.
I'm surprised that Bill de Blasio was actually able to make it tonight, to be honest. He was a terrible mayor. I don't give a if this is comedy or not. He was a terrible mayor. He did a horrible job.
People wrote about that moment like he was like telling a joke, like he was enjoying himself when he said that. He clearly was not. He was annoyed and aggravated and saying it with no humor at all. When Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump gave that speech at a Catholic event at the Al Smith dinner last month, it made the crowd sort of increasingly uncomfortable with his swearing and his nasty digs at people. This was supposed to be a lighthearted, self-deprecating comedy set for a Catholic audience. When he instead got up there, I was really mad and started just swearing. I think we wrote it off as one weird night. As I said, there were sort of write-ups of that event that made it seem like maybe that was part of a joke. It clearly was not. But now, in retrospect, I think we can see that that night, that very deeply unfunny, angry night at the Al Smith dinner was kind of the signal for how the close of the campaign was going to go. I mean, the campaign close started there. It has since included the big rally in Madison Square Garden with the Trump warm-up acts calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, calling Kamala Harris the devil, and flipping middle fingers at the cameras. There was also the rally in Pennsylvania where Trump waxed poetic about the size of another man's penis and then swore while he was describing Kamala Harris. He screamed out angrily, "You're an S-word, Vice President." If you want to take the data-driven approach, the New York Times found that Trump resorted to swear words in public at least 140 times just this year. He swears so much more now than he did in the 2016 campaign, for example, that some experts told the New York Times that his profusion of profanity could be a sign of an aging brain. It's one of the things that happens when you get to sort of super senior status. If you've ever been royally cussed out by a very elderly relative you didn't know had it in her, you know what I mean. But even beyond all the surprising and unfunny, angry swearing, Trump's closing message in his campaign, it just hasn't sounded like the kind of stuff you say when you want people to vote for you. Yesterday, for example, Trump told a rally that his second term will, quote, be nasty a little bit at times, and maybe at the beginning in particular. Vote for me, it's going to be nasty, especially right at first. Who says that to people who you want to vote for you? His de facto campaign CEO, Elon Musk, is telling people in the closing days of the campaign that they should be prepared for economic hardship if Trump is reelected. Vote for him. There's also just the strangeness and unnecessariness of so much of the closing message. Trump, for example, in his closing events for his campaign, has been talking now about rabbits being killed by solar panels. Trump has talked about there being alien life on Mars. Elon Musk has assured Trump supporters that there are aliens walking among us. Trump fantasized at one of his final campaign rallies about a dinner, like a dinner party between the long-dead mob boss Al Capone and his friend, the MyPillow guy. Not Al Capone's friend, Trump's friend. He wants Al Capone and the MyPillow guy to have a dinner party, and he went on and on and on about that in detail. This is a closing event for a presidential campaign. A closing event where he did not know what state he was in, trying to find a Republican Senate candidate from the wrong state in the crowd. I mean, one of the things that I think has been surprising to Trump himself, but is maybe not surprising to close observers of his campaign tactics and techniques right now, is that his closing rallies have been notably empty. His closing rallies have been full of empty seats. And lots of the people who have been coming have been leaving early. A lot of people are leaving as soon as he starts talking. And it's not like Trump's never been able to fill a room before. Sure, he has. He just can't fill one now at the end of his campaign. Kamala Harris is not having this problem. Her campaign says 75,000 people showed up for her closing argument speech at the Ellipse outside the White House last week. They had to close down access to the Ellipse and shunt people onto the National Mall instead because she filled the space outside the Ellipse. Tens of thousands of people there. And she was not there talking about rabbits and solar panels. Rabbits being hurt by solar panels? I still don't get it. She was not there talking about alien life. She was talking about America like this.
The United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised. A nation big enough to encompass all our dreams, strong enough to withstand any fracture or fissure between us, and fearless enough to imagine a future of possibilities.
Kamala Harris, the United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised. That's one way to close a campaign, or you could take a slightly different tack.
We're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened. That's what's happened to. We're like a garbage can.
Put that on a bumper sticker, right? From one campaign, America is a garbage can. A garbage can for the world. America is garbage. The other campaign says America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised. Choose your fighter. Whew. One more day.
Okay, we're taking another live look at Pittsburgh right now, where Vice President Kamala Harris is set to give one of her last big speeches on the eve of this election. It's the point in a campaign where everyone is basically out of gas, they're just running on caffeine, bad pizza, adrenaline, whatever. And the candidate has to dig deep to give one more speech, make their last best case to the American people. So as we wait for the vice president, I'm reminded of another historic candidate making his closing case. Here's Barack Obama in 2008, firing up one last crowd.
So, Virginia, I just have one word for you. Just one word. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Tomorrow you can put an end to the politics that would divide a nation just to win an election. That pits region against region, city against town, Republican against Democrat. That asks us to fear at a time when we need to hope. Tomorrow, at this defining moment in history, Virginia, you can give this country the change that we need. It starts here in Virginia. It starts here in Manassas. This is where change begins.
A lot of that still rings very true today. And I remember that night like it was yesterday. I was there. I suspect folks on the Harris campaign will remember it tonight just as well. Michael Steele is the former chairman of the RNC and host of The Weekend here on MSNBC. Liz Smith is a longtime Democratic strategist, and Jon Favreau served as Barack Obama's chief speechwriter. He probably wrote those remarks. He's also a co-founder of Crooked Media and a co-host of Pod Save America. Okay, so I wanted to play that because it is this moment that if you're on a campaign, you've done all of the things. You've got to get out the people tomorrow. That's what you're thinking about. But I've blocked out a lot of these nights from my memory. It's like you're so tired you don't even remember.
I don't want to go back.
I don't even remember. Okay, so Liz, you're on the Harris campaign. What's going through your minds? They're at desks, they're eating bad pizza, they're watching the rally. What are they doing right now?
Eating bad pizza, chugging 5-hour energy, Red Bull, all that sort of stuff. But I think they've got to be feeling pretty good about where things are. And it tells you a lot about where the two campaigns are closing. Mm-hmm. She's closing on a very optimistic, uplifting, energetic message. And she is filling these arenas, whereas Trump is closing on a dark dystopian message with that bro-tastic, to take your term, thing at MSG. He is embracing wholeheartedly RFK Jr., who is one of the most polarizing figures.
And take the fluoride out of drinking water for our kids, Liz.
Right, exactly, and control women's and children's health. So she's closing on a message I think is very broad, and that is appealing to a lot of people. He's closing on a dark, sad message with, frankly, the one superpower he always seemed to have in politics was his ability to have these huge crowds. Mm-hmm. It's gone. And so anecdotally, empirically, there's a lot of evidence that the momentum is on her side and that he's run out of steam.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. I mean, we've all been a part of so many campaigns, winning campaigns, losing campaigns. And there are things you watch, crowds, polls, there's so much data. Mm-hmm. What feels different right now to you, Michael, than 2016 in terms of what we're seeing right now?
It's a great question because a lot of folks have, kind of lulled themselves back into that space in terms of how they worry about this race.
Yeah. It's a part of the PTSD.
It's a part of the and I gotta work with my Democratic friends and help y'all through that.
All right,
okay?
all right.
It's gonna
Thank
be
you.
okay.
Soothe us.
It's gonna be okay. It is about the very things you talked about. That what's happening on the ground, the empirical evidence, the anecdotal evidence. In 2016, everything was off in that cycle. Mm-hmm. The polling was off. The mood was off. The voters were a little bit grumpy, and there were a lot of things that sort of moved the needle in a direction that a lot of people fed into this idea. If you were on the Democratic side, well, Hillary's got to win this, right? He's got to win this. And on the Republican side, it's like, oh my God, Trump's going to win this. And so there was that move. That's not this election. This is people right now it's very much to your point. The energy is very different on the ground in places like North Carolina, where the last poll out of North Carolina, the Democratic nominee is up by 2, right? Iowa, the Democratic nominee is up by 3. And you have to say, well, what's off? Well, it's not off because everyone feels better about this. Everyone feels good. I won't say everyone, but the mood is different than it was 8 years ago. And I think that says a lot about how in 107 days, Kamala Harris came out and she ran the race no one thought she could run.
Yeah.
And she ran it in a way in which she did not countenance interference from people who thought they knew better than her. She followed her instincts, and that's important for a candidate coming in, to follow their instincts and say, I'm just going to do me. I'm not going to do the standard pro forma stuff. I'm going to go out and when the press starts calling for me to sit down with them and talk to them because they're the most important thing in the room, I'm going to go to where the most important people are in the room, and that's the American people. And it changed everything.
Yeah, and one quick thing I would add is we're talking about the PTSD from the polls in 2016 and 2020. And I think we have all internalized that maybe a little bit too much because we assume, okay, all of the polls are going to underestimate Donald Trump's support. I don't know. Maybe they will tomorrow. But let me tell you what the polls have been like in 2022, 2023, and 2024. I worked on Tom Suozzi's special election in New York 3. Big race. He was an underdog, not expected to win.
Ran right into immigration.
Ran right into it. And going up to Election Day, the poll the day before showed him up 1 point. Republicans were crowing that their internals had him down 4. He ended up winning by 8 points. We also saw in 2022, Democrats vastly overperform the polls where they were. And what that tells me is that some of the polling underestimates the anger, the motivation that a lot of women feel to turn out, and that, frankly, a lot of people in the middle feel that Republicans have gone too far.
Women are pissed off. I'm just going to say that's my point.
We are.
Let me go to Jon Favreau because he's there, and he and I worked for a losing presidential campaign. It doesn't feel as good.
Well, 20 years ago, when I was in the middle of a different line of work, writing drama television series in Los Angeles, I had a revelation while waiting for my car at a parking valet after a party. Standing beside me was a wise, Oscar-winning actor, director, writer who had a couple more decades of experience in show business than I did and had enjoyed more luck than bad luck in his career. And he asked me what I was working on, and I told him about a couple of scripts that I was juggling, making sure that I didn't sound naive enough to think that those scripts were definitely going to get made. I thought I was layering in just the right amount of pessimism to sound professional, to sound like a realist. His eyes found mine, and he said softly, "Optimism is a choice. Pessimism is a choice, too. You can choose optimism." Then he got into his car, and I was left there realizing I'd heard something very important. And that's when I began trying to teach myself for the very first time in my life to choose optimism. And after a while, I actually got pretty good at it. I came to realize that choosing pessimism as an emotional defense against disappointment does not work. If you suffer a loss, you're going to be in just as much pain, whether you saw that loss coming or you didn't. And so I want to repeat to you tonight what that wise man said to me that night. Optimism is a choice. There is no reason for you not to go to sleep tonight without hope. Nelson Mandela went to sleep every night with hope. For 27 years, Nelson Mandela fell asleep with hope in his heart in the Robben Island prison. Nelson Mandela was an optimist. Nelson Mandela always believed he was going to get out of prison. He remained an optimist for those 27 years in prison. Nelson Mandela had more reason to be a pessimist than any of us have ever had. Nelson Mandela was an optimist for his future freedom when he was in prison and for the future of his country. In his inauguration speech as president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela said this.
We have triumphed in the effort to implant hope in the breasts of the millions of our people.
If Nelson Mandela could choose optimism, could choose hope, you can choose optimism. You can choose hope. If your hope is that Kamala Harris wins the presidency, you can be thankful that Kamala Harris and her staff have run as near perfect a presidential campaign as we have ever seen. Kamala Harris has justified your hope, and Kamala Harris has earned your hope. This is not the time to forget how to hope. Now is the time to enjoy that hope. Share that hope. Share that hope with your family, with your children, with your friends. Optimism is a choice. Hope is a choice. Choose hope. On this final day of the presidential campaign, the candidates made their closing statements to the country with Vice President Harris, as always, trying to unite the country.
We all have so much more in common than what separates us. There is power in that. There is power in that. And there's lasting power in that.
And of course, in Donald Trump's closing statement, he praised a convicted rapist and said he wished he could see the convicted rapist punch Kamala Harris, violently attack Kamala Harris. The convicted rapist is former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson, who was sentenced to 6 years in prison for rape, which did not in any way diminish Donald Trump's admiration for Mike Tyson, since Donald Trump has been found to have committed what a judge called the equivalent to the definition of rape by a civil jury in New York City. And of course, on the Access Hollywood tape, Donald Trump is a self-confessed, repeated sexual assaulter.
I know Iron Mike, and he's a great guy, Mike Tyson. He's a great guy. He's a good man. Hey, Mike's been through a lot, but he could fight. Let me tell you, that guy could fight. But can you imagine Mike? Oh, he says, put Mike in the ring with Kamala. That would be interesting.
Donald Trump, presidential candidate, says the convicted rapist is a good man. The Trump crowd, of course, cheered for the convicted rapist being given the chance to punch Kamala Harris, to knock out Kamala Harris. The Trump rally-goers should never be mistaken. With most Trump voters, 99% of those voters have never been to a Trump rally, would never go to a Trump rally. It's mostly repeat customers at those free Trump rallies. And just when you thought it was impossible for a candidate to be stupider than Donald Trump, we get 40-year-old James David Vance, who was unable to stay on the Trump campaign message about garbage for the final hours of the campaign. You will recall that the Trump campaign spent the last several days lying about Joe Biden calling Trump supporters garbage, which the president very clearly did not do. And for anyone who was confused about it, President Biden clarified that he did not call any people or person garbage. He called the racist jokes at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally garbage. Donald Trump, prior to Madison Square Garden, has called all Democrats garbage. He's used that word. Donald Trump has been calling Americans garbage in his speeches for a very long time. But the immediate lying stance the Trump campaign adopted is that it's absolutely outrageous for anyone to call another human being garbage. Trump fanatics, including Donald Trump Jr., apparently dressed up in garbage bags, trash bags, for Halloween to try to comedically make the point that no one should ever call another human being garbage. Donald Trump struggled to climb into a garbage truck on the campaign trail last week to try to reinforce the moralistic message that no one should ever call another human being garbage or trash or anything like that. And today, the stupidest vice presidential candidate in history blew the whole charade about the Trump campaign's delicate sensitivity about calling people garbage or, in this case, trash.
We are going to take out the trash in Washington, D.C., and the trash's name is Kamala Harris.
That man is 40 years old. If he lives his life the way his hero Donald Trump has, he's going to spend the next 38 years getting stupider. So when he is 78, the age Donald Trump is tonight, he will be even more incoherent than Donald Trump. But we can be very sure J.D. Vance will not be part of our politics when he is age 78, because his political career will surely end much sooner than that, possibly as soon as tomorrow night. This afternoon, Vice President Harris and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stopped by a Puerto Rican restaurant in Reading, Pennsylvania.
Yes. We don't hear no. Yeah. So I have to say, I eat no for breakfast. Which means I don't hear no.
And with us now, NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray, Basil Smikle, professor of practice at the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University, also a former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, and Lance Trover, a Republican strategist and a former spokesman for North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum's presidential campaign.
So, Mark, the NBC News poll also shows an enormous gender gap. Men backing Trump by 18 points, while women back Harris by 16 points. What does this tell us?
just how divided we are. I mean, you look at how women and men are in different places on this ballot. You can also look at it rural voters versus urban voters, voters by education, voters with college degrees, overwhelmingly backing Kamala Harris, voters without college degrees backing Donald Trump. And you add it all together, and that's why we're getting numbers that show 49-49, or in some of the battleground states, it's 48-47. But always do note that but there are people who are in the middle, and that persuadable middle does decide elections. And so in our poll, we have independents. Harris is ahead of them by 8 percentage points. You know, late deciders will end up mattering. But overall, you know, when we get to like what our poll shows, just how fundamentally divided we are as a country.
Basil, what do you make of the gender gap when it comes to the results?
Well, it's interesting because, to your point, you know, what Kamala Harris has had to do in this short period of time is both persuasion and GOTV. And in that, for that small percentage of voters that might be persuadable, I think about, you know, the Julia Roberts ad. I think because they wouldn't have put money behind that if they didn't think that there was something there where a lot of women may want to vote differently from what their husbands may want them to do. I think about the language of Donald Trump and his supporters at MSG. So all of these things happening late in the campaign gives, to me, Kamala Harris an edge because she has the money to spend, the opportunity and the messaging to be able to go after that small segment of voters.
And Lance, over the past few weeks, we've heard, you know, talk from Donald Trump, from his allies about shooting through the press, pointing guns at Liz Cheney, calling Puerto Rico garbage, giving RFK Jr. and Elon Musk major roles in the White House. Is that the best message to close with?
I say this time and again. I think it's best when both sides stick to the issues, and certainly Donald Trump, if he sticks to the issues, he leads on the economy, he leads on immigration every single time. It's his winning message. I just don't think there's like an ownership on either side. I mean, we've spent the last month of October, the Harris campaign, amplifying fascism, amplifying Hitler and Nazism and the other stuff. So as much as I'm critical of when Trump says stuff like that, I'm also critical of the other side. To Basil's point, though, I think it's very interesting. The Harris campaign has kind of made a strategic move here at the end. And I think it stems from, we saw reporting last week in the New York Times and also some in the Washington Post this morning, where Harris's super PAC has been warning the campaign about the talk of fascism and the attacks on Donald Trump's character and saying that that's not been working. And I think that's why you're seeing a pivot to the completely positive messaging that she's got going here in the last 48 hours of the race. So what that tells me is she's not closed the deal, and she still has some work to do with the independents that you were talking about and getting them to the polls for her.
I mean, all campaigns do change their message in the final days, in the final weeks. I mean, it's a process. It's a work in process. But Lance, I'm wondering, like, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal urging people to vote for Trump, saying in part, I don't agree with Trump 100% of the time, but I do agree with him most of the time, and I disagree with Ms. Harris nearly all the time. That makes this an easy call. It certainly hasn't seemed like it's been an easy call for her in the past. What do you make of this? And is there anything that this could have an impact on in these final hours?
Well, look, we have 7 states that are in half a point, right? I mean, Mark's been talking about the polling, and so you need to buckle up for the next couple of days because it's going to be a wild ride. And I think that, look, the Trump campaign needs help with some of those voters out there. I'm glad to see she's saying what she's saying and putting that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I think that she echoes probably what a lot of people do. They don't necessarily love some of Donald Trump's rhetoric. I mean, voters are very clear-eyed about who he is in terms of what he says at some of his rallies and stuff. But if you look at the polling, it consistently shows that they look back at his presidency quite fondly, and they know that they were better off financially during his presidency than they are now when prices are up over 20% over the last 4 years. So you put that together, I think she echoes the sentiment of many voters out there who may not love some of his rhetoric, but they certainly look at his policies as being good for the country and getting the country back on track.
And just a reminder, Nikki Haley's called Trump unhinged, that he wasn't qualified to be the president of the United States because of things he said about the military and U.S. service members. But I want to pivot to what we just saw out of Idaho in this latest polling that really sent shockwaves, that sent shockwaves through the political universe this weekend. This is a state Trump won by more than 8 points in 2020. And the Des Moines Register sees the vice president up by 3 points within the margin of error. Again, this is in Iowa, Mark. Well, how do you read this poll?
I think there are two ways to read it. One, Ann Selzer, who conducts, is one of the most respected pollsters, public pollsters in the country. And so we end up getting sometimes some shocking results. And I think we have to actually take her numbers very seriously. They could actually be showing momentum. Even if Harris isn't able to win a place like Iowa, her performance with female voters, females with college degrees, could say something. But the other way to kind of read it, there are outliers that we end up having in polling, even by the best pollsters that are out there. And so the guidance that I have, and I'm trying to communicate, we should take this poll absolutely seriously, but also a little skeptically, too.
Well, the vice president is spending her final full day in Pennsylvania, going throughout the state, but not leaving Pennsylvania. There's questions of, is this a day when maybe she should be in other states as well?
Pennsylvania is very important, and I know from the last couple of weeks, so many people I know are getting on the bus and going to Pennsylvania, going to other states. And she spent a lot of time in Wisconsin as well. So I don't think anything is off the table, but clearly there's a lot of emphasis on Pennsylvania. And going to the point about the economy, because I have to say this, the economy has been better. By every major metric, the economy has actually done better under Joe Biden's presidency. Yes, prices are up and inflation had gone up a little bit. But I have to tack that to the rhetoric, because what Donald Trump has done is made people say that their neighbor has been the one rigging the system against them. That is not true. Whether you're an immigrant, whether you're a person of color in this country, they are not your enemy. And what Kamala Harris has tried to say is that, look, there are forces out there, there are institutions, there are people that are the ones that are rigging the system against you, making you feel like you have to project that anger and that frustration on your neighbor. So when you tie the economy to the rhetoric, Donald Trump has tried to point the finger, and Kamala Harris's campaign has said, no, it's all of us in this together moving forward. And that energy is what's fueled the last couple of months of this campaign.
And guys, let's do a lightning round real quick in terms of what we'll be watching for tomorrow night. I'll start with you, Lance.
It's the big three: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, no question about it.
Mark?
Your state of Florida.
Really?
Because, and not because who's going to win, because it casts the ballot so quickly. And even though we expect Trump to win, we're going to be able to measure his strength or weakness, and vice versa for Harris, really fast by 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. So I think we'll know how the winds are blowing, even if we don't know who's going to actually win.
And what?
The whole state. We will see almost every ballot counted in a 2-hour period in Florida. So it's going to move very fast, and we'll get the first great indication of how the night is going.
I'm looking at Pennsylvania. I'm looking at Colin Allred in Texas. I'm also looking at the African-American voters, because Donald Trump spent a lot of time trying to suppress that vote. Kamala Harris trying to bring that out. So I'm looking at those numbers carefully.
Let's also talk about crime in this election. Right? Everybody's talking about the polls, I know. Let's talk about national security and about crime. You've seen all these headlines in the lead up to Election Day tomorrow, particularly today. There's a ton of these headlines about right-wing pro-Trump groups planning to sow chaos around polling sites in the election. Right-wing pro-Trump groups forming an army to try to stop the counting of votes. Paramilitary pro-Trump groups planning to menace people. Pro-Trump groups planning violence around the election. Bringing back all the things they tried to do in 2020 to overthrow that election, up to and including the violence they tried on January 6th in Washington to stop the certification of the vote. Seen all these headlines about how it's all coming back. They're going to try it all again. You know what all of that is? All of that is crime. Violence of any kind for any reason is a crime. Intimidating election workers or public officials or voters is a crime. Paramilitary militias are themselves a crime. The leader of the Proud Boys is serving 22 years in federal prison right now. I mean, even the fake electors thing, impersonating electors, that whole fake elector scheme was a crime. It was a crime in 2020, and just because you're thinking about trying it a second time doesn't make it any more legal than it was back then. Law enforcement didn't know what these pro-Trump groups were going to try to do in 2020, right? Law enforcement didn't know what these guys were going to do in 2020 any more than the pro-Trump groups did. They sort of felt their way through it and just crimed along the way as they made stuff up. But now law enforcement knows what these pro-Trump groups and the Trump campaign are going to do. And if these guys are planning the exact same set of crimes in 2024, they're just planning on doing more of them in more places, This stuff doesn't get any less illegal. It just means there's going to be more arrests. Tonight in Philadelphia, the district attorney there just gave a news conference reminding anybody who's excited about committing crimes tomorrow to try to mess with the election. He gave a press conference reminding that those crimes will be treated as crimes. Just because you're thinking about doing your crimes for Donald Trump doesn't mean they're not crimes and that you won't be going to prison for committing them. Watch this from the Philly DA. I mean, inject this straight into my veins, honestly, but also, please, just watch this.
I want people to be reassured that when they get up tomorrow to go vote, if they have not voted already, that everybody in this city is working and has been working for months to make sure that there will be nothing tough about that experience and nothing to fear in that experience. But I also want to be clear, anybody who thinks it's time to play militia, F around and find out. Anybody who thinks it's time to insult, to deride, to mistreat, to threaten people, F around and find out. We do have the cuffs, we do have the jail cells, we do have the Philly juries, and we have the state prisons. So if you're going to try to turn an election into some form of coercion, if you're going to try to bully people, bully votes or voters, you're going to try to erase votes, you're going to try any of that nonsense, we're not playing. F around and find out.
Pennsylvania officials also circulating the hotline you can call to report voter intimidation in that state. F around and find out, we're not playing. That applies to anybody who wants to commit crimes, targeting voters or polling sites or anything else about our election. And you know what? It doesn't just hold in Philly. It holds everywhere. I would just say one last point here. It also applies to anybody thinking about trying to paper over those crimes to try to give them an air of legality. I mean, there is a reason why Rudy Giuliani is not only under indictment right now, he also no longer owns any of his worldly possessions. Because Rudy Giuliani used his position as Donald Trump's lawyer to come after innocent poll workers in Georgia who have now literally sued him out of his house and home. Just a few days ago, Thursday, Halloween, the lawyer who quarterbacked the fake electors scheme for Donald Trump was indefinitely barred from ever practicing law in New York State again. I mean, while they are taking away the law license of the guy who organized the fake electors last time, which got all the fake electors arrested, here's Politico.com reporting today that Republicans are nevertheless bringing all the fake electors back again to try it one more time. Whereupon, let me let you know, it is still illegal, and you're all going to get arrested again. As the Philly DA said, F around and find out, nobody's playing. Trump fake electors guy Kenneth Chesebro was indicted and pled guilty to a felony and has now had his law license suspended. Trump lawyer Jenna Ellis was indicted and pled guilty and had her law license suspended. Trump lawyer John Eastman has been indicted and had his law license suspended. Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani has been indicted, has been permanently disbarred, and has been irrevocably and profoundly bankrupted for life. And that is just what happened to the lawyers. Messing with an election in the United States of America is a crime. This election, there is a lot to pay attention to. So pace yourself. People are going to try to rerun 2020 and interfere in the election, try to use violence to get their way. They are going to get arrested and they are going to go to prison. And we are going to have that crime story to deal with if they try it. We are also going to have a big national security mess to clean up just from the Trump campaign, even if Harris wins. There's so much we're going to need to stand up for and be ready for, and it does not stop tomorrow, no matter what happens tomorrow. So, my friends, deep breaths. Hydrate. Beer back in the fridge, wine back on the shelf. We have lots of work to do. Tomorrow's just the start.
3 failed Republican candidates for Senate in Georgia since 2020. David Perdue, Kelly Loeffler, and Herschel Walker all took the stage to back former President Trump at his Macon, Georgia rally yesterday.
It is time for it to stop, and it stopped on Tuesday when we get to the polls and we vote for my friend and your friend, Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump, Donald J. Trump.
If you voted, you're not done. You got to go get other people to vote. Get people you go to church with, people you party with, people you know, people you like, people you don't like. I don't care. Take them all.
We are going to turn out and make sure he can tell Kamala Harris, Kamala, you're fired.
Khalil Loeffler, I don't know how to pronounce your name, despite the fact I've pronounced your name a million times. Let's work on it. Kamala. Yeah. Kamala. Can you do that? Yeah. Come on. Kamala. Come on. Yeah. Give me a break. Anyway, let's bring now the Democrat who I think beat all of those people and about 14 people behind him in the crowd. That's Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia. He's a surrogate for the Harris-Walz campaign. Senator, thanks so much for being with us. What's Georgia looking like?
Good morning. It's great to be with you. Look, I'm feeling good. Welcome to Battleground, Georgia. This race will be tight, as were all of my how many? 5 races. But I beat 2 of those folks you saw on the stage, and we're going to deliver Georgia to the Kamala Harris column.
All right, Ed Luce is with us. Financial Times' Ed Luce is with us and has a question. Ed.
Senator, good to see you. Compared to 2020, what has Georgia done to improve or harm its election integrity since then? How do you measure Georgia 2024's election machinery against the last time?
Listen, the most important thing for folks to do right now is to show up to the polls. I am heartened by the historic early vote turnout that we are seeing. And but the reality is this election will be decided tomorrow. And so if folks haven't voted already, they need to show up. They need to make sure everybody in their circle shows up. Yes, there have been some machinations around elections here in Georgia. We're no stranger to that. We watched MAGA members of this state board of elections try some tricks, literally while people were voting in the very last hour. Thankfully, the court slapped those things down, and it will not stand. We will be vigilant in court. There are folks who operate in that lane, but I think the folks who are watching me who are asking, well, what can I do? You can show up. Half of life is showing up, and this election, again, will be decided tomorrow. The way to respond to voter suppression is to show up, because in a real sense, that's the effort, to so demoralize parts of the electorate that you don't even bother. And I'm proud that I'm a part of a party that, quite frankly, feels like its fortunes are better when the electorate expands, when more people show up. We have a coalition that looks like America. And I believe Georgia's going to deliver one more time for the American people.
Senator, good morning. It's good to see you. In a rally the other day, you sort of gave one of your sermons, in fact, and you said, we're going to talk a lot about policy. There are a lot of important issues, but you called this a moral moment in America and went on to say, which fits into the conversation we were just having, a moral moment in the church, speaking directly to evangelicals. What did you mean by that?
This is precisely that. I meant it, and I've been saying it. This is a moral moment in America. Elections are about the character of a country. And look, after tomorrow, this country's got to go through some healing. Ever since Donald Trump came down that escalator, public discourse in our country has been going down. And I just want to appeal to my pastoral colleagues who are on the MAGA side of this political ledger. I want to hear what they're thinking these days as we watched over the weekend talk about political violence, as we saw obscene gesticulations from a presidential candidate that caused some social media platforms not to be able to cover that part of his remarks. I'd like to hear from my pastoral colleagues about the family-friendly content of these MAGA rallies and how they explain that to their children.
All right, Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, thank you so much for coming on this morning.